Welcome everyone to this webinar by Environment and Climate Change Canada. My name is Jane Porter and I will be your moderator today. And thank you for taking the time to participate. Bonjour et bienvenue, je m'appelle Jane Porter et je serai votre modératrice aujourd'hui. Merci à tous d'avoir pris le temps de participer. As you'll see on the instructions on the screen, if you have any technical issues at all, please use the Zoom chat box and type in your question or I need tech support, and we'll reach out to you directly to help troubleshoot. Alors, utilise la case Zoom chat et poste votre question si vous avez des problèmes techniques. We'll have a mix of presentations and time for Q&A and comments throughout the next 1.5 hours. So please use the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel to type in your question or comment and view those posed by other participants. Use the upvote, the thumbs up button if you agree with a question or comment, as we will not have the time to answer everybody's questions. Using these upvotes will help us understand what you're collectively most interested in. Also note that we'll be reviewing the Q&A after the webinar and summarizing this input for Environment and Climate Change Canada. Alors, veuillez utiliser la touche Q et A sur le panneau de contrôle de Zoom pour taper votre question ou commentaire et voir celle des autres participants. This session will be recorded to share with those who cannot join today. Alors, cette séance sera enregistrée afin de la partager avec ceux qui ne peuvent pas se joindre avec nous aujourd'hui. With that, I'd like to pass it on to Danny Drouin, the Director General of the Plastics and Waste Management Director, le Directeur Général de Direction des Plastiques et de la Gestion des Déchets, for some opening remarks. So I'll pass it to you. Thank you.
Merci. Good afternoon, colleagues. It is for us an important moment.
Danny, we're getting some feedback. Can you just start over, please? Sorry, we were getting some feedback. Or stop your video, maybe. We have a full house, everyone, so maybe that's why. Danny, do you want to try again? So maybe what we'll do is we'll let Danny rejoin with some opening remarks, but we'll pass it on to Ryan to set off with some context.
Can you see me and hear me, Jane?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, excellent. So apologies, always good to get the technical difficulties right out of the gate. So we'll work to address those and hopefully we'll hear from Danny quickly.
Yeah, I'm here, Ryan.
Oh, actually, perfect. Okay, go ahead, Danny. I can hear you and see you, so that's great.
Okay, so there should always be a technical glitch, so hopefully that was the glitch. Let me just start back by saying we're very happy to host this webinar. I'm going to just do a few introductory remarks, mostly because I think we collectively have a very important opportunity here. As you know, plastic is a very important material. It performs important functions. It has a value. It is also a material that unfortunately we're sending way too often into landfills, or that the way we collectively manage plastics, we often lose that economic value. So just want to first starting that conversation to me is a conversation around recovering that value. So it is no way a bar on plastics. We just do really want to work with you to get that value back in our economy. And perhaps in some cases, some items would benefit to not be in the marketplace on the first hand. So I just wanted to say this. The other thing I want to say is for those of you who may not be fully aware of our legislation is the federal government, the Climate Change Canada, to prevent and manage pollution. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act is it. This is the act at our disposal. So there's a proposal in the discussion paper to list plastics manufactured item under Schedule 1 of SEPA, and that listing is important in order for the federal government to access the toolkit, or all of the tools that are included within the SEPA. And you've heard the minister at the announcement a few weeks ago being very clear that the title of the Schedule 1 includes the word toxic, but in any case, we are referring as plastics as what we would commonly understand toxic substance. And he mentioned, for example, that CO2 is also on Schedule 1. So this is important for the conversation. This is important because you'll see that we're after objectives and commitments related to plastics that will require action across the life cycle at different stage of the design, collection, disposal, recycling of plastics. So the listing is intended to allow that authorities to be used if necessary. And there's an indication to use that authority for 6 products, and we will discuss this as well. The other thing I want to say is we're in a very particular situation because of COVID-19. In an ideal case, we would be hosting those sessions face-to-face in various places of the country and have those conversations, which would be easier to have in person. However, that's a different environment, it's a different context. So we're committed to use technology as best as we can to allow for fruitful conversation. I'm mentioning COVID not only because of the difference in terms of engagement, but also as we're going to be moving forward, we will continue to consider and the impact of COVID, and in particular, as it has proven during the pandemic, that plastics play a key role, whether it's about masks or PPEs. And again, so we'll reflect this. Again, always want to go back to the problem. The problem here is that plastics end up in the environment, and that's what we need to fix. Or if it doesn't get into the environment, it gets into landfills, and then we lose the economic value. So it's really when plastics get out of the environment, out of the economy, that we're after. I'm also mindful of some of you that raised issues around accessibilities, and especially with people with disabilities or marginalized groups. We're going to spend time on this, and I expect everyone to give us on that issue, but also on every other issue, whether it's the listing, whether it's the list of products proposed to be banned or restricted, that we will work together, roll our sleeves, and share very concrete examples and advice on how to go forward. So je suis très intéressé à avoir des discussions avec vous. On a mis de cette façon une série de webinaires et qu'on a laissé à un certain endroit vers la fin de la série un genre de placeholder pour des enjeux qui vont être soulevés. Mais aussi, aujourd'hui, c'est un petit peu plus général. On va être très spécifique sur les enjeux dans les prochains webinaires. Et donc, j'espère qu'on va arriver ensemble à travailler sur des solutions. Et à partir d'aujourd'hui, on est intéressé à vous écouter, à connaître vos perspectives, vos vues, vos idées. Et sur ça, pour moi, aujourd'hui, je suis très heureux. On lance la conversation. On lance une conversation qui va durer un bon 2 mois. Ça ne sera pas la fin de la conversation non plus. Donc, sur ça, je vous retourne la parole, Jane, puis merci de nous aider dans ce contexte-ci. Allez.
Merci beaucoup, Ryan. Great, we're going to move on to our next presenter, Ryan Parmenter. Ryan is the Director of Plastics and Marine Litter Division, or le Directeur Division des Plastiques et les Déchets Marins. So I'll pass it to Ryan to provide a bit more introduction and context.
Hi, Jane, just double checking you can see and hear me. Perfect. Thanks so much. And it's really a pleasure to be here with such an increasing number of folks that are joining. So it's really great to be here. And we're looking forward to, as Danny mentioned, hearing your feedback on the proposed integrated management approach to plastic products. So my job will be just kind of provide you with an overview and an introduction, and then we can move into some of those key issues. So next slide, please. Thanks very much. So I won't spend a lot of time here on the table of contents, but this is just to let folks know how we're organizing the discussion today. You'll note that we'll have 2 discussion breaks where we'll get at some of our questions. And so there'll be some obvious breaks in the presentation where we'll do that. And this is just an overview of the topics that we're gonna kick off. So I'll leave that there and I'll move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this is an introduction slide. Danny's touched on a few of these points, so I also won't spend too long here. Obviously, plastics is playing an increasing role in the lives of Canadians and made ever so more important as a result of COVID-19. I won't go into too much more there, but this is all to say that also the government has kind of advanced multiple different layers of actions, both at the international stage, at the domestic stage, and the approach that it's using. So the next few slides are going to touch on a few of those points and explain kind of how we got to where we are today. And one of those elements is the Canada-wide strategy on zero plastic waste. But the reason that we're kicking off this webinar was the announcement on October 7th by the federal government. And that was initiating, as Danny mentioned, the development of a management approach under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And so we'll break down a few of these points for you over the next few slides. Next slide, please. Okay, and so the purpose of today's webinar, there's a discussion paper that's available and hopefully folks have access to that and have maybe had a chance to take a look. We're here to kind of discuss and present and explain some of the details to you on that. The process is also designed to kind of initiate the discussion. This is kind of just a first step. But overall, as Danny mentioned, really the key objective here is to seek your feedback on the proposals that are outlined in the discussion paper. So we look forward to working with you on the next steps there. Next slide, please. Great. So I won't spend too long. I think Danny touched on a really few key and essential points about the critical role that plastics play in the lives of Canadians. I think there's also a recognition that there is extreme growth in the use and development of existing plastics, but also unique and innovative approaches that are developing that's increasing the amount of plastic that is being produced. But there's also a significant economic contribution that the plastic industry plays in Canada. It's a $10 billion virgin resin industry. It's a $250 billion plastic manufacturing industry, and also a $350 million recycling industry as well too. So you can see the economic contributions of plastics is unquestionable. But it's the flip side of how we kind of address some of the issues that are associated with plastics. The overall average of recycling rates for plastic in Canada is quite low at 9%. The plastic waste that is lost into, or it represents kind of a large economic loss for the Canadian economy. And Deloitte has done some work to put a figure on that, saying that the price tag might be as high as $7.8 billion, and that's fairly significant. So it's encouraging to kind of move towards a circular economy approach to address that kind of issue. And then certainly last but not least, there are significant environmental consequences and issues associated with plastic waste entering the Canadian environment and what that does to wildlife, ecosystems, rivers, lakes, and oceans. And that's part of what we're here to discuss, the ways forward to address those issues. Next slide, please. So to address that issue that we just kind of laid out on the previous slide, the government has really kind of three main large initiatives that are undertaken. The first is the Ocean Plastics Charter. The second is the Canadian-wide strategy on zero plastic waste. And third is the comprehensive federal agenda on plastics. And the next few slides are just going to break down each one of those in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So the first is the Ocean Plastics Charter. So this is a very kind of, it's a mechanism that the Canadian government has used to demonstrate leadership on the international stage. So the notion is working also with other countries towards some of these objectives, but also with industry as well too. So the Ocean Plastics Charter lays out a series of ambitious objectives that are outlined on the slide here. I won't go into too much details, but this really was a key initiative on behalf of the government that set the stage for Canada to begin its action on addressing the issues of plastic. So we'll move on to the next slide. Perfect. So moving from the international stage down to kind of the national approach that is being used. Domestically, the federal government needs to obviously work with its federal, provincial, and with provincial and territorial governments, as these are the bodies responsible for regulating and overseeing the waste management systems in the country. And the mechanism to doing that is the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, or CCME. So this is an approach that the federal government has participated in working towards the Canada-wide strategy on zero plastic waste. So they've developed action plans related to the objective of zero plastic waste. And there are a few that are highlighted on the slide, those last three bullets that I'll just point out, which include kind of facilitating consistent extended producer responsibility policies, national performance requirements and standards for plastic, looking at increasing recycled content, as well as infrastructure needs to determine kind of what infrastructure exists and maybe what are the other key investments that might be needed to address plastics along the life cycle. But there is also there's broader work, but those are just a few of the highlights related to the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. So moving to the next slide, please. So this slide has two purposes. The first of which is really to show that the government has an extremely broad and comprehensive agenda working to address plastics. And the second one that I'd like to really point out is that It really indicates the roles and responsibilities and the fact that everyone has a role to play in addressing the issue of plastic. And I can walk through a little bit of this. So the bottom of the slide mentions kind of the international element, which is the Ocean Plastics Charter and the international work. We've touched upon that. And at the very top of the slide, there's the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment. And that was the one that was addressed just on the previous slide. So the ones in the middle are really about some of the other items that the government is undertaking to address this issue. Policies and regulations, so that's certainly one that we'll be touching upon through the webinars and the approaches that we're going to discuss. But the next one is really getting the federal house in order. So that's looking at federal operations and seeing if there are ways we can do much better on the issues related to plastic. Another element is advancing a science agenda, kind of looking at innovative approaches and also better understanding the impacts and issues related to plastics in the environment. And then certainly another key element is looking at innovative industry-led solutions to some of the plastic-related issues. And last is really about Canadians as well too, mobilizing Canadians, citizen science, cleanup projects, other demonstrations that could be kind of undertaken to address the issues of plastic. So essentially what this shows is that there's a role for everyone, and this broad government agenda cuts across not just Environment and Climate Change Canada, but a lot of the different federal departments that work on these elements with us to address the issue of plastics. So we'll move to the next slide, please. So we'll turn now just to the science assessment. This is one of the key steps that helps to kind of advance the issue to the point that we're at right now. So a draft science assessment was published in February 2020. And then the finalized science assessment, which didn't change dramatically between the draft and the finalized version, really takes a good look at the extensive amount of studies and science to identify the state of the science associated with the potential impacts of plastic pollution on the environment and human health. And out of that, a few key observations were found. First of which is that there's obviously multiple sources that contribute to plastic pollution, which is a key point that touches on why we're using an integrated management approach. And we'll talk about that in a few seconds. But also that macroplastics are shown to cause physical harm to wildlife through entanglement, ingestion, and habitat disruption. So those are two key points. And the real call to action from the science assessment is kind of the first bullet in the blue box, and that's stating that precautionary action is needed to reduce macro and microplastic pollution. So that's one of the key issues that kind of led us to the federal government to taking action in this area and grounded in its actions in science. So I'm going to move to the next slide, please. So this brings us kind of closer to kind of the reason that we're here today and outlining the approach that the government has taken, has decided to take and propose under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And the first step of this is really, as Danny really, I think, quite nicely mentioned at the beginning, this is the central act that allows the government to take a broad range of actions through various means. And I think that's a really critical point. So there are different mechanisms that are available, but this is the mechanism that allows the government a big enough toolbox to kind of address and select the appropriate places for the federal government to act along the life cycle of plastics. So that's why the mechanism is chosen. And to a similar point, that's also the reason that plastic manufactured items was identified as the wording to be added to Schedule 1 of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And the intent here is that we've discussed kind of the broad nature of the issue. And I think most folks would probably agree that addressing one single issue related to plastic probably isn't going to get us to the goal of zero plastic waste. So the intention of the language that's being used is to provide the opportunity for the federal government to make targeted and strategic interventions where there's an appropriate role for the federal government. So the act and the wording are designed to kind of to address the life cycle approach for plastics in meaningful areas. So I think this is my last slide, and I think we'll move to the next one, and this will be a discussion breaks. So I'll turn it back over to Jane.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Right on time. Thank you. Maintenant, on a 15 minutes pour les questions et réponses et commentaires. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers and comments. So we see that there are several coming in. So I think we'll go with our first one, which is how do I add an item to the ban list? So Ryan, I think we are trying to give you a break, but you might go if you can ask that or answer that one, that would be great.
Right. Perfect. No, thanks for that. So I think the list that's put forward is kind of the recommendation and the approach. And I think Shannon in the next part of the discussion is going to kind of outline how we identified the 6 items and the process that we use to identify the items for that potential ban. So my kind of question back is we would like to hear from folks on their thoughts on those 6 items and if additional items might need to be considered and how and why they might recommend kind of additional items to be added. So I might put the question a little bit back to stakeholders and kind of say we're very interested to hear thoughts on what other on the list that we currently have and suggestions maybe for alternative approaches.
Great, thank you. We have another question here with regards to the single-use plastic ban. So why have you not followed a similar path or approach on what are at least as important measures, for example, recycled content and extended producer responsibility? Both Europe and California are being very proactive on recycled content and Europe on a wide list of EPR target materials. So why the lack of detail or ideas on these 2 very important action areas? And I'll pass it to whoever would like to take this one. Ryan, Shannon, Danny.
Shannon, are you there? Do you want to take a crack at this one?
I can go. I can take it.
Perfect.
So that's an excellent question, and I think there's a different responses to that question. The first is we need to start somewhere, and the mandate letter of Minister Wilkinson include a specific reference to the restriction in some harmful single-use plastics. So that's where the work plan is cut for us. So we will start with this with meeting the commitment of the Prime Minister to ban some harmful single-use plastic in 2021. The discussion paper provides questions and views and looking at perspectives on how we would go further, whether from a regulatory or a non-regulatory perspective. And as you know, on EPR, there's quite a lot of work happening with provinces and territories. So we want to continue to be in step with provinces and territories on that particular issue. I don't know, Shannon, if you want to add something to what I said. Thanks.
Oh. No, Danny, and I think actually as sort of this webinar continues and certainly the next few get underway, I think, there will be opportunities to sort of unpack some of these areas a bit further and to dive a bit more fulsomely into these topics.
Thank you. La prochaine question pour Danny encore. Quel est le lien entre la consultation sur l'approche de gestion des plastiques et les plastiques qui seront contrôlés dans le cadre de la Convention de Bâle sur les déchets dangereux?
Oui, merci Jenny. Si c'est correct, je vais répondre en français aussi. Donc, la consultation sur l'approche sur les plastiques vise les produits et les items manufacturés avant qu'ils deviennent un déchet. Comme vous savez, les parties à la Convention de Bâle ont adopté des amendements en 2019. Ces amendements vont viser à ajouter des contrôles pour le mouvement des transfrontaliers et entre pays de certains types de plastique, de déchets de plastique. Et le Canada est en train de développer le processus pour accepter ces amendements-là qui, en principe, devraient venir en vigueur le 1er janvier 2021. Donc, il y a 2 jours, les amendements sur le plastique ont été tablés au Parlement pour une durée de 21 jours et les parlementaires pourront avoir des discussions sur ces amendements-là. À partir du moment que cette période-là est terminée, le processus continuera, là, qui éventuellement va mener à une communication du Canada aux Nations Unies pour accepter ces amendements-là. Donc, c'est relié en soi, mais l'approche qu'on parle aujourd'hui est beaucoup plus centrée sur l'approche intégrée de gestion des produits pour éviter qu'ils deviennent un déchet plastique. Et lorsqu'il devient un déchet plastique, il y a un régime international qui va permettre, sous certaines conditions, les mouvements transfrontaliers. Donc, dans la pratique, ça va vouloir dire que certains exportateurs auront besoin d'un permis, ils vont demander à Environnement Canada ce permis-là et Environnement va demander le consentement prior informed consent du pays importateur. Comme ça, si eux acceptent, donnent leur consentement, le permis sera émis. On va, dans les prochaines semaines et mois, avoir une communication plus large avec l'ensemble des stakeholders et des exportateurs pour clarifier un peu comment le régime va fonctionner. Donc, c'est relié, mais pas tout à fait.
Well, merci, Danny. We have 2 similar questions. So one comment or question was, solving a waste issue should not be handled through SEPA. And another comment saying, plastics is not toxic. The science assessment states that. Why not pass legislation to accomplish your goals of reducing plastic waste instead of creating confusion in the public? Plastic has a lower environmental footprint than the alternatives in almost all cases. So I think I might pass it back to Danny to respond to this one.
Merci, Jane. There is no doubt that when plastics get into the environment, it poses harm to biodiversity, to animals, ecosystems. There's no doubt here. And then the question is a very relevant question around what else could we be using? And here I think some are referring to a potential circular economy Act, for example, and that is indeed a possibility. However, if a legislation takes quite a lot of time to get in place, and it was decided that the government wanted to move forward on plastics now in 2021. So that is one of the reason why there is a willingness to use SEPA, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the act that we usually use for managing pollution or preventing pollution. Would that change in the future? I do not know. But we should definitely continue to have that conversation because we're never on n'est jamais garant du futur. Les choses peuvent toujours changer, évoluer. Donc, c'est important pour nous de connaître les perspectives et les vues concrètes des gens sur cette question-là. Alors, à vous, Jane.
Thank you, merci, Danny. We have about 5 minutes left for Q&A, so please continue to add there. For the next question, related to the single-use plastic ban. So we received a few questions on the scope of the proposed listing, include whether we should add plastic bottles. So for water meets the 3 requirements be added to the list of banned plastics. They are harmful to the environment. They're difficult to recycle since bottles from virgin fossil materials is cheaper. And the strongest reason is that they are readily available. There is a readily available alternative. And so maybe I'll just, so I might just pass that question to, who is the best person here to answer on the plastic bottle question? Ryan?
Well, so Jane, just one quick comment on that one is happy to kind of address that one, but I think a bit of Shannon's presentation is kind of going to touch on this one, and that might be a better one to maybe come back on after Shannon has kind of worked through the framework. I just think we might be able to provide a more targeted answer after we've presented some material there.
Great. Yeah, and I think feel free, people on the team, should we just shift to Shannon's presentation, because a lot of the content here might be actually answered by her?
I think that's a good way of going. Just I can see kind of the nature of some of the questions, and it might be a good way to jump into Shannon's material. Perfect.
Thank you. So Shannon's already ready to go. So Shannon Castellarin is the manager of Plastics and Marine Litter Division, La Gestionnaire Division des Plastiques et des Déchets Marins. So I'll pass it to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. I think before I start, I will also do a sound and visual check. So can you hear and see me?
You're good to go. Thank you.
Perfect. Great. Okay, so in this next section of the webinar, I would like to start by building upon some of the ideas that Ryan and Danny presented on earlier. So a few things. So we heard that plastic plays an important part in the lives of Canadians and the Canadian economy. However, there are concerns with how plastics are being managed. So Ryan mentioned that a significant amount of plastic ends up in our landfills with very little amounts being recycled. And I think the fact that there is so much plastic going in the landfill means that we're really missing out on opportunities to recover this plastic and have it flow back into the economy. So another point I also want to draw upon is the amount of plastic pollution that enters the environment. So it was also mentioned that we have approximately 29,000 tons going into the environment each year as pollution. And so it's really the coming together of these two concepts or ideas. So better life cycle management to recover plastics and have them flow back into the economy, combined with actions taken in some cases to eliminate plastic pollution, that is going to help us achieve our objective of zero plastic waste. And this is what forms the background of the integrated management approach that's presented in our discussion paper. So with that, I do want to talk about a circular economy and the need for a circular economy. And particularly in the case of plastics, this is one where we would have better life cycle management, where this plastic would be recovered and would re-enter the economy. However, as noted on our slide, there are some challenges that we will need to overcome. And some of these that are listed. So there's competition with primary plastics. This is mostly in the recycling industry, where they're making secondary resins, where often production is at a lower rate and there aren't the opportunities to take advantages of economies of scale. We also see weak end markets for recycled plastic, and this has to do largely with the inconsistent supply of quality feedstock. Collection rates are low. So I think I saw a statistic that noted that only 25% of plastics are collected and sent to a sorting facility. Recovery options are sometimes inefficient. And this can largely be due to the fact that, the cost for landfilling is quite low. And I think another point too is just where, where is the cost of plastic pollution being shouldered? And it really, a lot of times it is sort of on communities, volunteers and civil society organizations. And this can be at a great cost. However, despite these challenges, there are things we can do, but to that end, no one measure can overcome them completely. And so our integrated management approach is really looking at putting in place a series of regulatory and non-regulatory measures that would achieve a number of objectives. We have some of them listed here. So they include things like eliminating some sources of plastic pollution where needed. But then again, we also want to create these viable secondary markets, particularly for recycled plastics. We also want to have better value recovery. And we also want to support innovation. And that's something that's really underlying to really help us achieve that objective of zero plastic waste. So if we move to the next slide, this presents a diagram that outlines the key components of our integrated management framework. So the first component of the approach that I want to talk about is our framework for managing single-use plastics. And this is where we outline the way in which we group the various single-use plastics to come up with the items we're proposing for the ban. And this framework also, though, more fundamentally, it provides a real systematic approach to categorizing or grouping single-use plastics on the basis of criteria. So these include things like whether or not they cause environmental harm. So for example, is wildlife getting tangled up in them? Or do they cause problems to existing waste management systems, such as our recycling systems? So then once we've determined or we've grouped these individual plastics, we establish risk management objectives. And then we look at how do we pick the right risk management instrument or tool to manage them. So the second key component that's also illustrated on the slide is the need for product performance standards. So this is where we'll look at recycled content requirements. And a third main component of our integrated management approach is end-of-life responsibility. So this is where we identify our commitment to working with provinces and territories to advance extended producer responsibility initiatives. So if we move to the next slide, here I'd like to get into, before I get into the details of our risk management framework, I want to spend some time on how we choose our instruments to manage single-use plastics. So as a first step, we need to determine the objective that the instrument needs to achieve. So we have an environmental objective that Ryan mentioned of zero plastic waste. And our risk management instruments will then take a number of steps to move us closer to achieving this environmental objective. And then depending really on how the single-use items are categorized or groups, we'll have a number of different risk management objectives. And these will range from, on the one end, from banning or restricting an item to being able to establish performance requirements. So the risk management instrument is ultimately the tool that we're going to use to help us meet our management objective. Now, Ryan mentioned earlier that the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA, provides a range of authorities that can use to develop both regulatory and non-regulatory instruments, and that these instruments can really be applied at different points along the life cycle of a plastic products. So non-regulatory instruments, they include things like guidelines or codes of practice, and these are instruments that can be used by other governments or even industry, and they can complement existing initiatives, or they can help inform the scope for new ones that are under development. Regulatory instruments are intended to really ensure that we have the rules in place at key stages along the life cycle to ensure that we're driving the needed change to achieve some of the objectives I've described earlier. So some key considerations for choosing an instrument. There are a few, and we see some that are listed here on the slide. So a few I'll highlight is we ultimately need to look at how effective will this instrument be in achieving our environmental objective. Socioeconomic considerations are also important, and these include things such as costs and benefits to various groups, as well as the potential impacts to health and safety. And I think Danny also mentioned, that there are certain groups that we do want to have a discussion with, just to ensure that we're really capturing some of these distributional impacts appropriately. So if we move to the next slide. Donc, un autre point que j'aimerais souligner que notre approche proposée reconnaît que tout le monde a un rôle à jouer. Cette diapositive présente un certain nombre d'acteurs clés. Et le message clé à retenir est que, compte tenu du rôle que jouent diverses personnes, il est important qu'on entende les Canadiens au cours de cette période de consultation sur l'approche proposée de gestion intégrée et qui est décrite dans le document de consultation. So if we move to the next slide. So I've spoken a little bit about our risk management tools and how the management framework of single-use plastic works. I'd now like to touch on what constitutes the single-use plastics. So single-use plastics include a range of different plastics. Really, the common thread to all of these is that they're designed to be thrown away after one use. So some of the common categories that are indicated in the slide include packaging, convenience items, and essential items. So even within these, there's a lot of variation. So example for packaging, we have primary packaging, so things like food wrappers, but then there's also secondary or very short-lived packaging where it's not actually used for a very extended period of time, such as say a fruit or vegetable bag. We have other items like convenience items, which include things like straws and stir sticks. And then we have essential items such as masks and gloves that are found in the dental and medical field. So These items are found in a variety of implications, and they also, as a result, present a lot of, can present a number of challenges in regard to some of the environmental harms. So being able to determine which harms they pose, particularly when they're littered or they end up in the environment. And in a lot of cases, we're seeing that they have low recovery rates. So this is where they're not really compatible with existing recycling or composting systems. However, despite these challenges, there is a potential for new and innovative technologies to come up with solutions. And these solutions can be in a range of areas. And as an example, on the materials side, some materials such as compostable or bio-based or biodegradable products may have the potential to improve environmental and value recovery outcomes. And this is a consideration we'll be taking seriously as we develop our risk management measures. And one of the things we will be looking at when we design in particular our ban on single-use plastics is how we can design this regulation to both ensure we're working towards our environmental goal of zero plastic waste, while also supporting the growth of new and innovative technologies and that transition to a more circular economy, which I had mentioned earlier in this presentation. So if we move to the next slide, I'd like to spend some time talking about sources of data that were used to select the single-use plastic items that we analyzed in our risk management framework. So in terms of which items to focus on, we really did have to look at a number of sources. And this is really due to the fact that single-use plastics are used extensively in all sectors of the market. And that being said, and as a result, form a significant portion of the litter we're finding on beaches and shorelines. So as mentioned in one of my previous slides, single-use plastics do have a wide range of use. And so this makes it challenging. So it's not only challenging in develop a comprehensive picture and how they're produced, used, and disposed of, but it also means there's really no one size fits all when it comes to risk management. In terms of some of the data that we've used, and we have some of the key sources listed here. So citizen science was a big one. And this is where we looked at what is actually being collected in some of the shoreline cleanups. What is washing up on our beaches and shorelines? And what we did find from here is that among the top items that were being picked up in these cleanup initiatives, single-use plastics were always probably within the top sort of 10 to 15. Another key finding was that often items with recycled content or even bio-based items were also washing up and being found as part of the litter that was collected. Other work that we also undertook is, so we commissioned reports. So ChemInfo did a report for us in 2018 on single-use plastics in Canada. And in this study, we profiled 4 key product categories, so things like bags, food service items, and packaging. And here we gathered information on the quantities of plastics, as well as some of their recycling rates. And then this study we complemented a year later by a report by Deloitte, which Ryan mentioned earlier, and it was an economic analysis. And this study was one that provided sort of a picture in terms of how much or what portion of single-use plastics and packaging are found both in the economy and as part of the waste stream. And I believe I recall that single-use plastics and packaging make up about 1/3 of the plastics used in the economy and about 40% of what we're finding in the waste stream. Other things we did is we also undertook specific sector research where we developed profiles on different areas that are known to use single-use plastics. So some of these included the grocery and food sector, restaurants, transportation, and personal care products. And the focus here was really to look at what are the initiatives around single-use plastics, particularly in terms of how they're managed, and also looking at existing gaps and really looking at what are the sectors that maybe have taken more steps and initiatives versus others. Our analysis also led us to looking at what's being done in other jurisdictions, so both domestically and internationally. So domestically, we looked at the municipal, provincial, and territorial level, and this is where we reviewed things like litter audits, single-use plastic reduction strategies, and in some cases, we also looked at final instruments that were eventually put in place. Internationally, a few big pieces of work that we looked at were the Waste Reduction Action Plastic Pact that was undertaken in the United Kingdom and the European Union Single-Use Plastic Directive. And both these initiatives provided a list of items that have been prioritized for action. And just a point is, it was interesting that as we sort of conducted this analysis, we found that many of the same products were prioritized in several different jurisdictions. So if we move to the next slide, voici la liste des articles en plastique à l'usage unique que nous avons obtenus par l'entremise de notre cadre de gestion. Cette liste est basée sur l'analyse des différentes sources de données mentionnées dans la diapo précédente. So if we go to the next slide, this is where we get into a description of our risk management framework. So this risk management framework is essentially a 3-step process. And I just wanted to also state that we will be discussing these 3 steps in more detail in some of the upcoming webinars. In addition, I also want to mention that this is our first cut at coming up with a systematic way to manage single-use plastics, and that we really do welcome any feedback you may have. So the first step, which is the column on the left, is how we group items based on whether or not they meet the criteria that have been identified in this slide. So in other words, whether or not they're environmentally problematic, value recovery problematic, or in some cases both. So environmentally problematic really refers to whether or not the item is causing harm to marine life when it's littered into the environment. And some of the characteristics that we would look for to determine whether or not there was harm include things like whether or not the item fragments easily. So is it breaking down into microplastics? Even just its natural form. Does it resemble natural prey for sea creatures? So I think I read that plastic bags sometimes resemble jellyfish, which is a natural prey of sea turtles. Other things too, like does it have a loop that can trap or entangle sea creatures? So that would be something we'd see in a 6-pack ring. And then there's other things too, like just the form. Is it sharp or shiny in the sense that it would potentially cause damage if it was ingested? So in addition to being environmentally problematic, we also look at whether or not it's value recovery problematic. And a key indicator is something like whether or not does it hamper recycling. So this could mean that the item frequently ends up mixed in a recycling stream, and then it causes difficulties either with the sorting or processing of equipment, or if it does make it through, that it could reduce the quality of the recycled plastic that's produced. And there could be many reasons for this. So for example, things like contamination, particularly for plastics that come in contact with food. Sometimes the material is just incompatible with the recycling technology. So I think I also read that things like plastic bags and films can sometimes kind of get stringy and form ropes, and that they can jam machinery. Other times too, we have things that are so small that they escape sorting and they get in and result in contamination. So in addition to some of these issues, there's also barriers to increasing recycling rate. And these include things like behavioral challenges. So it could be a resistance to maybe undertaking new practices, such as cleaning and maybe sorting containers. Sometimes there's a lack of access to collection mechanisms, particularly for things that aren't collected at sort of curbside pickups. And cost is another factor. And this could be for some niche items that maybe right now are only recycled by private companies. So one last consideration that is mentioned here is the consideration for exemptions. And this is considered when we categorize, but it's also a consideration that we feature and look at when we select our instrument. So the next step we're looking at is establishing management objectives. So these objectives, and they vary depending on the criteria that were met when we did our initial steps, so when we categorized. So for example, some of the single-use plastic items that met the criteria of being both environmentally and value recovery problematic, this is where we would want to set a more stringent objective, and we would want to eliminate or restrict that item to the extent possible. Then there's other items. So for example, for an item that's maybe only value recovery problematic, the risk management objectives may focus on increasing recycling or improving recovery rates. And then the last sort of third step in this management framework is instrument selection. And I don't want to get into this in too much detail because it was mentioned earlier in our presentation. So if we move to the next slide, this looks at a triage, or this looks actually, sorry, at the results of our categorization process. And on this slide, we've listed the 6 items that are being proposed for a ban. And you'll notice that these are ones that meet all of the subcomponents of being either environmentally problematic or value recovery problematic. On the next slide, we then look at other items that were categorized through our management framework. And for these ones, we meet various subcomponents under either being environmentally problematic or value recovery problematic. And I do want to make a point here because there was a question on beverage bottles. So you'll see here that they met the criteria for environmentally problematic, but they didn't meet the criteria for being value recovery problematic. And this is because there are recycling programs and systems in place. And so that is one of the reasons why they were not proposed on our initial first cut of the 6 items that we intend to ban. And so this then leads to the next slide, slide 24, or sorry, yeah, so the next slide for the 6 items that we have identified for the ban. So really, these are the items that, again, they met both criteria of being environmentally problematic and value recovery problematic. So I think at this point, I feel like I've presented quite a bit of information, and I would like to pause to see if there are any comments on the proposed management framework. So back to you, Jane.
Great, thank you very much, Shannon. We do have a lot of question and answers coming at us. So one question, I think it will be for Ryan. The management tool does not seem integrated as it does not assess alternatives versus plastics in terms of GHG, life cycle, social, environmental, economic impacts, to name a few criteria. Is there any plans to take a more comprehensive approach as full life cycle of products is required to make assessments?
Thanks very much for that, Jane. I think as part of the management framework for single-use plastics, the government is going to take into account the alternatives that are available for different single-use plastics items. And I think it's really important to consider that the alternatives need to be thought of with respect to a circular economy and that work towards achieving a zero plastic waste goal. So we're certainly interested in considering the relative life cycle impacts of both the plastic item and the alternatives, and hopefully use that kind of assessment into how we design our instruments in working to address that.
Great, thanks. Another comment here, I think for Shannon. Much of the 29,000 tons of unmanaged waste is in landfills, and it is questionable if it harms the environment. Quick solution is to close these landfills and deal with the actual human behavior of litter in the waste.
So thanks for that comment. I think human behavior does come in to an extent when we develop some of our risk management instruments. But I think the reality is, and certainly for the ban, that there will be some things that we need to put in place to really sort of direct and drive behavioral change. But I do welcome that comment, and I find it an interesting one, actually. So thank you.
Another one here for Ryan. Beyond the CCME, the Canadian Council for Ministers of the Environment, how will the Government of Canada engage provinces and territories to empower a common harmonized approach?
Thanks very much, Jane, and thanks for the question. I think it's really safe to say that the Canadian Council of the Ministers of the Environment is the federal government's primary tool for engaging and working with the provinces. And we have the Canada-wide strategy on zero plastic waste, which has kind of 2 sets of action plans. So I don't want to say that that's not going to be the mechanism that we're going to continue to use, because that's the table around which we discuss this issue. But I think what's really important for stakeholders is if they're interested in providing feedback on where they specifically see a federal role or a well-suited intervention or involvement that the federal role can play in working towards, a common harmonized approach. So I'll put that one back to the stakeholders. Welcome their feedback on that.
Thanks. Another question here for Shannon regarding bioplastics. Section 4.1.1 in the science assessment concludes that there's a lack of evidence that biodegradable etc. plastics will degrade in the environment. Is this why these end-of-life problem plastics are not included in the proposed management approach? Would strong consultation feedback to not make these materials exempt have sway in the final ban and restriction? And there's also, maybe you can answer that and there's a follow-up question.
Sure. So the management approach or the management framework was really intended to be broad and to be evergreen. And I think, it wasn't that these plastics were included or excluded. And I think, we do have the opportunity to really run them through the management framework and to really see, how would they fare up if we applied them against the criteria of being, are they environmentally problematic? Are they value recovery problematic? And I think it's just that we haven't necessarily delved into that detail just yet, but certainly welcoming, the opportunity to explore further, particularly given some of the subsequent webinars are really going to look at the management framework in more detail.
Great thing. And part 2 of this, there are currently none or very limited options to recycle compost bioplastics such as PLA, PHA, or the like, as they need controlled composting facilities and don't degrade in a timely manner in open air compost. Are bioplastics going to be included in this ban, even if they are sourced from sustainable material and not petroleum-based products?
And I think this is where we really want to hear from people, so from Canadians, from stakeholders, just sort of a bit of that, some views, but also too, it's important to back, information up with sort of scientific findings and fact. And again, also for us, if our metric is really how does it fare in our management framework, I think then whatever information we have, that's the metric that we'll be evaluating it against. But again, early days in our process, and we're certainly interested in hearing from people just views on this issue.
Thank you, Shannon. Une question pour Danny en français. Pouvez-vous clarifier la différence entre le bannissement et la restriction de l'usage de certains articles de plastique que vous présentez dans le document? Qu'entendez par restriction de l'usage versus bannissement?
Jane, c'est possible de juste répéter la question, s'il vous plaît? J'ai pas, la dernière partie est la plus importante, puis je ne l'ai pas entendue.
Pouvez-vous clarifier la différence entre le bannissement et la restriction de l'usage de certains articles de plastique que vous présentez dans le document? Que entendez par restriction de l'usage versus bannissement?
Oui, parfait. Donc, en fait, cette question a surtout lieu à certaines exemptions qui seront peut-être possibles. Donc, une interdiction viserait une interdiction complète et une restriction pourrait être interprétée, si on peut le dire, d'une interdiction partielle. Donc, une restriction dans l'usage. Certains produits devront probablement être éliminés dans le contexte du cadre d'analyse, mais d'autres produits continueront d'avoir une fonction et lesquels pourront être restreints dans leur utilisation. Et donc, c'est la différence entre les deux. On entend parfois parler des pailles, par exemple, où les pailles pourraient être encore nécessaires pour certaines parties de notre société. Merci.
Great. Okay, I think maybe one more question and then we'll pass it back to Shannon. So one, I think this is going to be for Ryan. Curious why in roles and responsibilities, NGOs and academia were not called to action when they will be key implementation partners.
Thanks very much for the question, and that's really good. And the intention certainly was not to exclude those groups. In fact, I hope that we made the case that kind of addressing the issue of plastic waste requires the participation and engagement and involvement of everyone. So apologies if the specific titles weren't included, but I know on the federal government's agenda, particularly related to advancing science, the science agenda that the federal government has. Obviously, academia has a role to play. And the federal government also partners with NGOs on various projects to address plastic waste and plastic pollution. Absolutely correct. They're going to play a key role moving forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you. We'll carry on with the presentation and then return to the Q&A after that. Alors, Shannon, est-ce que vous voulez continuer?
Okay, so if we go then, oh, I see you're on. Okay, so this next section is shifting gears a little bit. So we're moving away from our risk management framework. And this is where, I'd like to kind of get back to some of the concepts around sort of recycled content. So we've already alluded, earlier in the presentation to the fact that in some cases there may be a weak market demand for recycled plastics and some of the difficulties recyclers might have in competing with some of the cheaper primary resins. So to address this issue, and as sort of presented in our discussion paper, we're proposing to introduce minimum recycled content requirements for plastic products. So these regulations would support the targets that we have in the CCME action plan. So these are targets where we've committed to at least 50% recycled content requirement, or so 50% recycled content in plastic products by 2030. And so what this will do is it'll create a more stable and certain demand for the need for these products. So we're hoping that this in turn will drive investments in recycling operations, really allow innovation and the scaling up of new technologies. And we're also hoping that it could spur better design and also make sure there's more availability for feedstocks to be able to meet these targets. And so the box on the right outlines a few things we're considering in our proposed approach. So we're looking at establishing a minimum percentage of recycled content requirement, really looking at what are some rules that are going to be needed for measuring and reporting the percent of recycled content requirement, and then also what's needed as support. So support in terms of technical guidelines and other tools like standards. In terms of the how we're going to do it, we really want to hear from Canadians on this. And so in the discussion paper, and certainly here in the slide, we've proposed a range of options. So we could either go very narrow, so by resin, where we would establish recycled content requirements by specific resin type. We could go quite wide and set economy-wide targets and not differentiate at all how they're met. Or we could go a bit more narrow and tailored. And even within that tailoring, there's flexibility. So we could look at, product categories. So say, for example, rigid containers and film packaging, or even just look at sectors as a whole. So the packaging, maybe an electronic sector. But that said, there are things that we do need to consider along the way. So, in particular, some of the technical and technical barriers that exist. I've sort of read that there's, concerns around food safety that would need to be met. But also too, I think there's some fundamental design concepts that we would need to tackle as we determine what the scope of this initiative would be. So even just the definition of recycled content, where do we draw our lines? Do we consider pre-consumer as well as post-consumer resin? And how do we really track along the value chain? So what is the certification that would need to be generated by a recycler and then, passed off further down the value chain? And then another concept that we want to ensure that we're really holding true to is flexibility. So, we want to make sure that regulatees, companies, are able to innovate, are able to meet targets. And so this will really go to what's the best approach to doing so. And maybe it's not a one size approach fits all. So, do we kind of go on a product specific basis, or do we really allow companies to determine where in their product line they want to instill these requirements? So similar to some of the earlier ideas presented on the management framework, this is really the beginning of a discussion, and we really look forward to getting your feedback on this topic. So if we move to the next slide, another component of our integrated management approach is extended producer responsibility. And this is where I do want to touch on a few things about end of life. So end of life management is really crucial for ensuring that plastics stay in the economy and out of our landfills and ultimately out of the environment. End-of-life management can include a range of things. So it can be recycling, but it's also other elements such as reuse, repair, remanufacturing, and even refurbishment. And there's actually a waste management hierarchy that identifies a number of these activities. In terms of why it's needed, there was a 2016 statistic that was provided that pointed to the fact that only 25% of plastic waste is really collected for diversion and sent to a sorting facility. So, we've heard that from here, 9% is actually recycled. I think there's another point too, is that, we're not in this alone. And in fact, jurisdictions in Canada, so our provincial and territorial counterparts, recognize that really one of the most efficient ways to boost this collection and recovery is to make producers responsible. And often extended producer responsibility is the mechanism for doing so. And the reason why is because this approach, it establishes targets, but then it really allows it to producers who will be responsible for meeting these targets. And something I did also want to point out is, we're not starting sort of from scratch. So jurisdictions have adopted a lot of these extended producer responsibility management approaches. And in fact, some provinces and territories are currently developing either new policies or they're expanding on existing ones. So in terms of our role from a federal perspective, we will work to support our provincial and territorial counterparts. On the right side of this of the slide, we note the three main characteristics that we're hoping to see in doing so that we need to ensure that things are consistent, comprehensive, and transparent. So in terms of consistency, it's really just, from our federal perspective, ensuring as much as we can consistency across jurisdictions. And this is to create a level playing field and to reduce administrative burden. And it's really then also to allow companies to take advantage of economies of scale. Comprehensive, so we do have a target to achieve zero plastic waste, and we want to make sure that these programs are really working towards that objective. And then transparency, and I think this is really just linked to sort of accountability, and how do we ensure that there's transparency, that targets are being met, that data and the key data is being effectively communicated and reported. So another thing I did want to also note on, so I alluded to the fact, that we're not starting from scratch. So in addition to some of the initiatives that the provinces and territories are working on, we're also involved in the CCME action, through the CCME action plan, to develop national guidance. And this guidance will facilitate the sort of these principles, the consistent, comprehensive, and transparent extended producer responsibility policies for plastics. So again, we are working with provinces and territories to explore options and how gaps and some inconsistencies will be addressed, and sort of the role that we can play from a federal perspective. So I think there, that kind of wraps up some of the main components that we have in our discussion paper. If we go to the next slide, we get into some of the more procedural points that I'd like to raise. So, this is the first of many webinars. As you'll see from this timeline, they will be occurring quite frequently, actually weekly over the next month. We'll then have a final webinar in January to wrap things up. And I do want to point out that we are in a comment period for two things, for our discussion paper and the proposed order, and that this comment period does close on December 9th. If we move to the next slide. So this is a list of the webinars that should be available on our website, and it will allow folks to determine which ones are the most relevant. And hopefully after hearing this overview, it will help to decide where you feel it's best use of your time to participate. So I think with that, I'll turn it over now to you, Jane, so we can consider some next steps.
Great. On va continuer avec les questions et réponses bientôt. So we'll do some question and answers very soon. But I think it's on the next slide in terms of some next steps. The way to register for these webinars, many of you already have filled out a survey. That survey identifies who is interested in attending, and then we'll release it out to the public as well. But there is a cap in terms of how many people can join. And so they will be recorded for viewing for everyone as well. But good, let's go back to some questions. Many have come in. So I think this one's for Ryan on the recycled content. So rather than only a ban, has there been consideration for federal incentives to transition to more post-consumer resins or PCR or alternative materials? If those alternative materials meet common recycling standards, as there is a significant challenge related to consistent recycling systems across Canada.
Thanks very much, Jane. I think the integrated management approach that the government is putting forward kind of recognizes the need that to overcome the challenges associated with achieving zero plastic waste. You know, there's not one single measure is going to do that. And I think this question really nicely points that out. So for example, the management framework for single-use plastics identifies incentives to encourage reusable products or systems, but we're also consulting on how we can incorporate more recycled content into new packages and products. So really interested in hearing from stakeholders on some of those ideas of how we can kind of pursue those different measures to address these issues.
Great. Ryan, maybe we'll go to you again. How can the issues in the plastics industry be addressed? There's no market for recycled materials.
Okay, thanks for that. I think probably the end of Shannon's presentation kind of touched a little bit on that, and the discussion paper outlines a number of kind of market issues that have been raised. And the one proposal that it does put forward is the idea of establishing recycled content requirements. And so that's kind of an effort to make the economy, the plastics economy, a little bit more circular. So we certainly will need to considerably increase our recycling capacity in order to accomplish that zero plastic waste goal. So I think that's definitely an issue that's touched upon and we'll be looking at more closely.
Thank you. Great. There's some questions on recycling here. Some questions were posed regarding Canadian statistics. So one question was, how much plastic is actually truly recycled in our country and how much is still shipped to other countries? Will the government put more emphasis on industry responsibility rather than on citizens being responsible for recycling and cleanups? Shannon, I'm not sure if you have an immediate, I'm not sure if those numbers are at your fingertips right now.
So Jane, unfortunately, they're not, but I know that we would be drawing them, at least from our Deloitte report, and I believe that report is online. So what we can maybe do, actually, because we do have a webinar that will delve more into recycled content, is make sure that we can do our homework and come back with some of those stats for that time.
Great. Another question here, I think for Danny. How does the Canadian government intend to regulate the impacts of plastic products made outside of Canada? As a plastics recycler, we are quite familiar with corporate social responsibility and extended producer responsibility. However, how can we hold imported plastic product manufacturers to the same standards we intend to hold Canadian plastic manufacturers?
Thanks, Jane. That question is actually stealing one of my closing remark. What I want to say is that there's been few. I'm monitoring also the questions, and there's been few around the scope of the potential prohibitions and how to treat domestic and imported products. That's actually, we're looking for you to engage with us and give us kind of concrete ideas that we can advance that issue. So this one will be one where we'll get back into the conversation in the more specific webinars, and potentially also at the last one, which is a bit of a placeholder at the same time. So for those of you who are looking at that issue, what we are looking for you is concrete proposals on how to address those. so we can fully capture the perspective. So I will cross this one from my closing remark, but I might come back again to it. Thanks very much. That was a good question.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay, another question here. Let's see. Here we go. How are Canada's, and Danny, I think this will be for you again. How are Canada's actions being harmonized with our major trading partners? If plastics are declared as toxic, it will restrict their export to manufacturing locations abroad. Also impacts on import of products that do not meet our recycled content standards, if these standards are not required in larger markets.
Yeah, thanks again. First, we're not declaring plastics as toxic. Let's just be clear on what the proposal is. The proposal is to list plastics manufactured item on Schedule 1 that will then open up the various authorities, voluntary and non-voluntary authorities, for the government to act along the life cycle of plastics. So that's just want to clarify this because that's an important point going forward, and it will apply to every discussion we're going to have in the next few weeks, including on recycled content and other things. On the question on how we're going to make this happen with our trade partners, I say two things. One, we have had preliminary conversation with trade partners. We will have more conversation with trade partners, but again, looking for stakeholder, private sector, NGOs' views as to how best to achieve the environmental objective we're after in a way that that works for trade as well. And there's going to be more conversation on this one as well. So a bit similar but different than the previous question. We're going to dovetail and do more deep dives on those issues. Thanks.
Great. We do want to make sure that you have a little bit of time as well at the end to add in your comments into the Q&A. And some of them, they don't have to be responded, but a lot is asking for feedback, not asking for immediate responses. So we want to give you some time at the end to fill that, or to add some more comments in. We've already received lots, so thank you very much. So Danny, maybe I will pass it back to you just to share some closing remarks.
OK, merci beaucoup. Je vais les faire en français pour juste couvrir ça aussi. C'est très intéressant comme conversation aujourd'hui. Je dois dire que je ne m'attendais pas à autant d'engagement sur le chat. Donc, c'est extrêmement utile pour nous. Les perspectives sont diverses. Donc, je pense qu'on va avoir beaucoup de collaboration à faire ensemble pour en arriver à des justes milieux qui rencontrent les objectifs environnementaux qu'on cherche à atteindre. Je note aussi certains enjeux qui ont été soulevés un petit peu plus que d'autres. L'enjeu de la manufacture, de l'import et le scope des prohibitions est un qui est ressorti beaucoup. Il y en a beaucoup de questions et de commentaires aussi qui portaient sur les plastiques non conventionnels, bioplastique, l'innovation et tout ça. Il y a une question dans le papier de consultation sur ça. On est intéressé par vos commentaires spécifiques et concrets sur ces questions-là. Il y a aussi beaucoup de questions par rapport aux alternatives et on va passer du temps sur ça dans les prochains webinaires. En termes d'impact environnemental, socio-économique des alternatives ou aussi des interdictions proposées. Encore une fois, on est intéressé par du concret, des idées concrètes, des perspectives concrètes, du texte qu'on pourra utiliser éventuellement. Donc, ces 3 points-là, je voulais juste les mentionner. I also want to say that the discussion paper is online, and I invite people to read it and to comment on it. The webinars are not replacing the official consultation period that will close on December 9th. So I encourage you to provide written comment, concrete written comment, and to participate in the webinars. We want to do both in parallel, but today the discussion on the webinars will not replace the written comments. We will consider every question in the chat and all this as kind of a written comment, but please participate in the in the official written comment as well, including all of the questions that are at page 19 and 20 of the paper, because those comments will actually inform the next rounds of discussions, but also longer term discussion in 2022, 2023, and then will also help us with the way forward. So today, to me, is really the beginning of a conversation. And I really appreciated both the very pointed perspective that was shared, but also the vast or wide range of perspectives. So we fully appreciate your comments, your participation, the question, and really looking forward for the next conversation with some of you or probably not all of you, but some of you, because the next few will be much more into the weeds and the conversation around and the deep dives on specific issues, some of which you've also already touched upon today. So I'll get back to you. Over to you, Jane, and thanks for the opportunity.
Merci beaucoup, Danny. So thank you everyone for joining today. We want to remind you that this session has been recorded and it will be available to you shortly, and so that it can be shared with others as well. So thank you very much for joining us. Merci et bonne journée à tous et merci et au revoir. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great day.